We tend to imagine that our thoughts are the most intimate things we own. They feel like private property. They appear to rise from somewhere deep inside, carrying our intentions, our memories, our fears, our hopes, and our sense of who we are. They feel authored. They feel chosen. They feel like proof that there is a solid me sitting inside the head, pulling levers and making decisions. But what if this is not what is actually happening? What if the feeling of ownership over your thoughts is itself something your brain is producing, rather than something that reveals how the mind truly works? At this very moment, your brain is not waiting for the world to tell it what is real. It is actively guessing. It is continuously generating predictions about what you are about to see, hear, feel, and think next. These predictions arrive before the world does. Sensory information then merely checks whether those predictions are good enough. When they are, you experience a stable reality. When they are not, the brain quietly updates its story and carries on. You do not experience the predictions. You experience the final edited version. You experience the brain's best guess. Most of us grow up with the quiet assumption that the brain is something like a camera. The world exists out there, complete and finished, and our senses simply capture it and pass it inward, so that a little observer inside the head can look at the picture and decide what to think and what to do. In this picture of the mind, perception is passive, and consciousness is a kind of internal screen onto which reality is projected. It feels intuitive because it matches our experience of seeing, hearing, and feeling as though the world is directly entering us. But this intuition is deeply misleading. The brain is not waiting for the world to tell it what is happening. It is actively constructing what it thinks is happening, and it does so before most sensory information ever arrives. From the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep, your brain is engaged in a constant act of forecasting. It is continuously asking a single question in countless different forms: what is going to happen next? This question is not philosophical. It is biological. Your brain evolved to keep your body alive in a world that is uncertain, noisy, and often dangerous. To survive, it must anticipate what is about to occur so that it can prepare your muscles, your heart, your hormones, and your attention in advance. Waiting passively for the world to arrive would be far too slow. So the brain builds an internal model of reality and runs it ahead of time, generating predictions about sight, sounds, bodily sensations, emotional outcomes, and even social reactions. When light hits your eyes or sound waves reach your ears, that information does not enter an empty system that then figures out what it means. It enters a brain that has already made up its mind about what it expects to be there. The incoming signals are compared against these expectations. If they match closely enough, the brain does not need to change its model very much. You experience a smooth, stable world. If they do not match, the brain adjusts its predictions until the mismatch is reduced. What you experience as perception is the end result of this process. It is not the raw data from your senses. It is the brain's best guess about what must be out there in order to explain the signals that are arriving. This is why perception feels effortless and immediate, even though it is the product of enormous computation. You are not aware of the predictions, the comparisons, or the constant updating. You are only aware of the final construction. The brain hides its own work from you. It presents you with a coherent reality and lets you believe that you are simply witnessing what is already there. In truth, what you call reality is a controlled hallucination, one that is constrained by sensory input, but fundamentally generated from the inside out. The same principle that shapes your perception of the external world also shapes your experience of your own body. Your brain is constantly predicting your heart rate, your breathing, your temperature, your energy levels, and the chemical state of your blood. It does not wait for problems to occur before acting. It anticipates them. It adjusts your physiology in advance to maintain balance and stability. Your feelings of hunger, fatigue, anxiety, and comfort are not just reactions to what is happening in your body. They are part of the brain's predictions about what your body needs to stay alive and functioning. You experience these predictions as feelings and urges. Even though they are actually the brain's management strategies, being made conscious. This predictive nature of the brain also extends into the mental world of thoughts, memories, and beliefs. When you remember something, you are not playing back a stored recording. You are reconstructing the past based on your brain's current expectations and the fragments of information it has kept. Each time you remember, the memory is rebuilt, subtly altered to fit your present model of who you are and what the world is like. When you imagine the future, you are again relying on predictions, using the same internal machinery to simulate what might happen next. Even your sense of continuity, the feeling that you are the same person from one moment to the next, is maintained by a predictive process that keeps your internal model of yourself stable over time. Seen this way, the brain is less like a camera and more like a storyteller. It is constantly generating narratives about the world, the body, and the self, and then checking those narratives against incoming evidence. It revises the story when it has to, but it prefers not to. Changing predictions is metabolically expensive and psychologically destabilizing. It is far easier to maintain an existing model and explain away small errors than to rebuild the story from scratch. This is why beliefs can be so stubborn, why habits are hard to break, and why we often see what we expect to see even when the evidence suggests otherwise. The predictive brain is also deeply shaped by learning. From infancy onward, your nervous system is tuning its internal models based on experience. It learns what kinds of faces usually appear in your environment, what sounds belong to your language, what social cues mean approval or rejection, what situations tend to be dangerous or safe. These learned expectations become the lenses through which you perceive everything. Two people can look at the same situation and genuinely experience different realities because their brains are running different prediction models. What feels obvious to one person may feel invisible or even impossible to another. Not because one of them is lying, but because their brains are constructing the world differently. Understanding the brain as a prediction machine rather than a passive receiver changes how we think about truth, perception, and responsibility. It suggests that what we experience is always a collaboration between the world and our internal models. There is no pure, unfiltered access to reality. There is only a constantly updated guess that is good enough to keep us functioning. This does not mean that reality is an illusion in a trivial sense. It means that our access to it is always mediated by a living, biological system that has its own priorities, biases, and limitations. It also means that the feeling of being a detached observer inside the head is itself part of the prediction. The brain predicts that there is a stable self who is watching, choosing, and controlling. That prediction becomes part of the experience. You feel like a thinker behind your thoughts and a seer behind your eyes, even though what is actually happening is a distributed network of processes continuously updating a model of the world and of you. The sense of I am here, experiencing this, is one more useful construction that helps organize behavior, maintain identity, and coordinate action over time. When you begin to see the mind in this way, the familiar picture of a passive brain receiving a ready-made world quietly dissolves. In its place appears a restless, creative biological system that is constantly guessing, testing, and revising its own stories about what is happening and who is. You are not simply in the world. Your brain is actively bringing a version of the world into being for you, moment by moment, through a continuous act of prediction that you rarely notice, but that shapes everything you see, feel, and think. When you open your eyes, it feels as though the world simply pours in. Colors appear, shapes assemble themselves, distances make sense, and objects seem to present their meaning instantly. A chair is immediately a chair. A face is immediately a face. There is no sense of effort, no sense of construction, and no hint that anything complicated is taking place behind the scenes. The experience feels direct, as if perception is just the mind standing still while reality reveals itself. Yet beneath this smooth and effortless experience is a process that is far more strange and far more creative than it appears. Your brain is not waiting to be informed by your senses. It is actively predicting what it expects to be there before the sensory signals arrive. It builds a private internal world based on what it has learned in the past and what it believes is most likely to happen next. Incoming sensory information does not define this world. It only corrects it when the predictions are sufficiently wrong. What you consciously experience is not raw reality. It is the brain's best current guess about what reality must be like in order to explain the signals it is receiving. This is why perception can be described as a controlled hallucination. It is a hallucination because it is generated from the inside out, not delivered ready, made from the outside in. It is controlled because it is constrained by sensory evidence. The brain cannot simply invent anything it wants. Its predictions must be good enough to match the incoming data, or they will be adjusted. But within those constraints, your experience of the world is a constructed story, not a direct copy. Consider how quickly your brain recognizes a face. You do not analyze the geometry of eyes, noses, and mouths piece by piece. You simply see a face. This is because your brain has strong prior expectations about what faces look like. When light hits your eyes, the brain's face predictions are already running. If the incoming pattern of light fits those predictions well enough, the brain immediately delivers the experience of a face to consciousness. This is also why we sometimes see faces in clouds, shadows, and patterns on walls. The prediction machinery is so powerful that it can generate the experience of a face even when the sensory evidence is weak or ambiguous. The same mechanism explains why illusions work so effectively. In a visual illusion, the sensory data is deliberately arranged to push the brain's predictions in a particular direction. The brain settles on the interpretation that best fits its expectations, even if that interpretation is physically inaccurate. You do not choose to see the illusion. You cannot simply decide to see it differently. The prediction machinery delivers the experience automatically, and you become aware of it only after it has already been constructed. Perception is also deeply shaped by your emotional and bodily state. When you are anxious, ambiguous sounds are more likely to be experienced as threatening. When you are tired, the world can appear duller and less distinct. When you are hungry, food-related cues stand out more vividly. These changes are not just shifts in attention, they reflect changes in your brain's predictions about what matters most for your survival at that moment. Your emotional state alters the internal model that the brain is using to construct your reality, and your experience changes accordingly. Culture and learning also leave a profound imprint on your controlled hallucination. From early childhood, your brain learns what kinds of objects exist in your environment, what they are called, and what they are used for. These learned categories become part of your predictive machinery. They shape what you notice, how you group things together, and what you consider meaningful. A person raised in one cultural context may literally perceive social cues, gestures, and expressions differently from someone raised in another. These are not just differences of opinion. They are differences in the internal models that construct perception itself. Even something as seemingly basic as color is part of this construction. The wavelengths of light reflected from objects are not colors in themselves. Color is a perceptual experience created by the brain to make sense of those wavelengths in a way that is useful for distinguishing objects and guiding behavior. What you experience as red or blue is not a property of the world alone. It is the brain's interpretation, shaped by both biology and learning. Your controlled hallucination gives the world a palette that helps you navigate it, even though the world itself does not come labeled in this way. Because perception feels immediate and undeniable, it is easy to assume that what we see must be the truth. But what we see is always filtered through prediction. This does not mean that perception is arbitrary or meaningless. It means that it is optimized for survival, not for objective accuracy. Your brain constructs a world that is good enough to keep you functioning, finding resources, avoiding danger, and maintaining social bonds. Accuracy matters only insofar as it supports these goals. This understanding can quietly transform how we think about disagreement and misunderstanding. If each of us is living inside a slightly different controlled hallucination, shaped by our own histories and expectations, then it becomes less surprising that people can look at the same situation and experience it in incompatible ways. They are not merely interpreting the same facts differently. They may actually be perceiving different realities, each generated by a different predictive model. This does not mean that all perspectives are equally valid, but it does mean that our experiences are not neutral windows onto a single, shared world. Your sense of being located in a stable, external reality is therefore something your brain actively produces for you. It feels like you are simply present in the world, but in truth, your brain is continuously generating a version of the world inside itself and presenting that version as if it were the world itself. You live inside a story that your brain tells in real time, a story that is constantly being revised, but that feels seamless and self-evident. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about this story is that it usually works. It allows you to move through complex environments, recognize friends, avoid dangers, and pursue goals with astonishing efficiency. It creates the experience of a solid, reliable reality, even though that reality is always a best guess rather than a direct imprint of the world. You do not experience the guessing. You experience the result. You experience a world that feels given, stable, and unquestionably real, even though it is continuously being invented for you in the background by a living, predicting brain. There is a quiet assumption that lives at the center of everyday experience, and it is so familiar that it rarely gets questioned. It is the assumption that you are the author of your thoughts. When an idea appears in your mind, it feels as though it was produced by a central you that intentionally created it. When an emotion rises, it feels as though it belongs to you in a deeply personal way. When a decision forms, it feels as though there is a clear moment where you chose it. This sense of authorship is woven into language, memory, morality, and identity. We speak of my thoughts, my feelings, and my decisions, as if there were a single point inside the head from which they all emerge. Yet the machinery that generates these experiences tells a very different story. Before a thought ever enters your awareness, vast networks of neurons are already at work. They are integrating sensory input, internal bodily signals, emotional states, memories, and learned expectations. They are calculating what is most likely to be useful, safe, or relevant in the next moment. By the time a thought becomes conscious, the work has already been done. You do not witness the construction of the thought. You only experience the finished product. It appears in your mind fully formed, carrying a sense of familiarity and ownership that makes it feel as though you must have created it deliberately. This is why thoughts can sometimes feel as though they arrive out of nowhere. An old memory suddenly surfaces. A worrying idea intrudes in the middle of a calm moment. A creative insight appears while you are doing something entirely unrelated. These experiences reveal a simple truth. The processes that generate thoughts are operating continuously and automatically, far below the level of conscious awareness. Consciousness does not direct most of this activity. It receives the results. The feeling that you are the author of your thoughts is itself something your brain constructs. It is part of the same predictive machinery that constructs your perception of the world. Your brain predicts that there is a unified self who is thinking, choosing, and controlling. It then presents the products of its internal processes in a way that fits that prediction. The result is a seamless experience of ownership. Thoughts do not feel like anonymous events happening in the mind. They feel like they belong to someone. They feel like they belong to you. This illusion of authorship is deeply useful. It helps coordinate behavior over time. It allows you to take responsibility for actions, plan for the future, learn from the past, and maintain a coherent identity. If your experiences felt like a random stream of disconnected mental events, your sense of self would fragment. You would struggle to maintain goals, relationships, and commitments. The brain's solution is to bind these experiences together under the story of a stable me. That story makes life workable. But usefulness does not mean literal truth. When neuroscientists measure brain activity, they often find that the neural signatures of decisions appear before people report having made those decisions consciously. The brain begins preparing actions milliseconds or even seconds before the person feels that they have chosen. The conscious experience of deciding seems to arrive after the machinery has already started moving. The feeling of choice is not necessarily what causes the action. It may be part of the narrative the brain uses to make sense of what it has already set in motion. This does not mean that consciousness is meaningless or powerless. It means that its role is different from what we intuitively believe. Conscious experience may function more as an integrative workspace, where information is brought together, evaluated, and broadcast across the brain, rather than as a central command center issuing orders. The sense of, "I decided this," may be a summary of what the system as a whole has already converged on, rather than the original cause of the decision. The automatic nature of thought generation also explains why we often struggle to control our own minds. You can decide to focus, but your attention still drifts. You can intend to feel calm, but anxiety still arises. You can promise yourself not to think about something, and then find that it returns even more vividly. These are not failures of willpower in the moral sense. They are reflections of how the brain's predictive machinery prioritizes what it believes is important for survival and stability. If a particular thought or feeling is tagged as significant, it will keep resurfacing, regardless of your conscious preferences. Even the content of your inner dialogue is shaped by forces you did not choose. The language you think in, the metaphors you use, the categories you rely on, and the values that guide your judgments were all learned from your environment. They were absorbed gradually through culture, family, education, and social interaction. When a thought appears that feels uniquely yours, it is often built from pieces that were placed into your brain long before you had any say in the matter. Your mind is not a blank slate expressing a pure inner essence. It is a living system shaped by countless influences, continuously generating thoughts that feel personal because they are happening inside you, not because you consciously authored them. Recognizing this can be unsettling, but it can also be liberating. If your thoughts are not fully under your command, then you are not required to identify with every mental event that passes through your awareness. A disturbing thought does not have to define you. An anxious prediction does not have to be taken as a final truth. You can relate to your thoughts as events generated by a living system rather than as perfect reflections of who you really are. This shift can soften self-judgment and reduce the grip of unhelpful mental habits. Instead of asking why you are like this, you can begin to notice how your brain is trying to solve problems, manage uncertainty, and keep you safe, even when it does so imperfectly. You can learn to work with these processes rather than fighting them as if they were personal failures. Your thoughts still matter. They still shape your actions, your relationships, and your future. But they are not simple products of a central inner author. They are outcomes of a complex, adaptive system doing what it has evolved to do. They feel intimate, chosen, and self-defining because your brain presents them that way. Beneath that presentation lies a continuous, automatic flow of prediction and correction that is quietly generating the mental life you experience as your own. There is a powerful and persistent feeling that sits at the center of experience, a feeling so constant that it becomes invisible. It is the sense that there is someone inside your head who is watching your thoughts, feeling your emotions, and making your decisions. This someone feels like the owner of your life, the core of your identity, the thing you point to when you say, me. It feels as though this self is stable, continuous, and in control, moving through time as the same entity from childhood to adulthood to old age. Yet when we look closely at how the brain actually operates, this inner commander begins to fade into something far more fragile and constructed than it appears. Your brain is a collection of specialized systems, each handling different aspects of perception, memory, emotion, movement, and bodily regulation. There is no single place where you reside. There is no central control room. Instead, there is a constantly shifting pattern of activity distributed across networks that interact, compete, and cooperate. At any given moment, different systems may be influencing your behavior for different reasons, seeking safety, pursuing reward, maintaining social bonds, or conserving energy. The sense of a unified self arises when these processes are woven together into a coherent story. This story is built moment by moment. Your brain continuously predicts not only what is happening in the world, but also who you are within it. It predicts that there is a stable identity, a continuous subject of experience, and an author of action. It then presents your thoughts, memories, and intentions in a way that fits this prediction. The result is the feeling that there is a single I behind everything you think and do. This feeling is not something you discover. It is something your brain creates because it is useful. The usefulness of the self story is difficult to overstate. It allows you to link past experiences, to present choices and future plans. It gives your life a narrative arc. It enables accountability, learning, and social cooperation. Without a stable sense of self, promises would lose their meaning, relationships would fracture, and long-term goals would become nearly impossible to maintain. The self, in this sense, is a powerful organizing principle. It is a model that the brain uses to coordinate behavior over time. But like all models, it is a simplification. It smooths over the messy reality of distributed, competing processes and presents a clean, unified image. When you make a decision, many different neural systems contribute, each weighted by emotion, habit, memory, and context. Yet your experience compresses all of this into a single moment of I chose. When you recall a memory, countless networks reconstruct fragments of the past, but the experience feels like a single observer remembering. The complexity is hidden. The simplicity is presented. This compression creates the illusion of authorship. You feel as though you are the one who is thinking, deciding, and acting. In reality, what you experience as authorship may be the brain's way of summarizing the outcome of many underlying processes. It is a narrative layer added on top of distributed activity. It is not necessarily the original source of your actions, but it feels like it is because the brain presents it that way. The illusion of a stable self is further reinforced by memory. Each time you remember your past, your brain reconstructs it in a way that fits your current identity. You remember being you. In childhood, even though your body, your beliefs, your knowledge, and even your brain structure were dramatically different, the continuity of identity is maintained by selectively preserving and reshaping memories so that they form a coherent personal story. This story gives you the feeling that you have always been the same person, even though the biological reality is one of constant change. This does not mean that the self is fake in a trivial sense. It is real in the way that a nation, a company, or a currency is real. It exists because it is collectively and internally maintained. It has effects. It organizes behavior. It shapes relationships. But it does not exist as a single physical object inside the head. It exists as a dynamic pattern, a set of predictions and narratives that the brain continuously maintains. Understanding the self in this way can change how we relate to ourselves and to others. If the self is a construction, then it is also flexible. It can be reshaped by experience, therapy, reflection, and learning. This is why people can change their habits, heal from trauma, and redefine who they are over time. The brain can update its self-model just as it updates its model of the external world. It can also soften rigid judgments. When someone behaves in a harmful or confusing way, we often assume there is a single inner agent who freely chose to act that way. But if behavior arises from the interaction of many systems shaped by biology, history, and environment, then blame and praise become more complex. Responsibility still matters, but it can be paired with a deeper understanding of the forces that shape action. Perhaps most profoundly, seeing the self as a constructed narrative can reduce the grip of suffering. When painful thoughts and emotions arise, they often feel like they define who you are. You may think, "This is me. This is what I am like." But if the self is a dynamic model rather than a fixed essence, then these experiences can be seen as events within the system rather than as the final truth about your identity. They are things that are happening, not necessarily things that you are. Your sense of being a single, continuous, controlling I is one of the most powerful experiences you have. It feels solid, intimate, and undeniable. Yet beneath that feeling lies a living network of processes that are constantly updating, predicting, and negotiating with one another. The self you experience is a story that your brain tells in order to make sense of this activity and to guide your life through time. a story that feels like the deepest truth about you, even though it is continuously being created in the background by a biological system that never stands still. Realizing that your mind is built on prediction rather than direct access to reality quietly changes the meaning of many familiar experiences. It does not simply add an interesting scientific detail to your understanding of the brain. It subtly reshapes how you relate to fear, identity, responsibility, and choice. When you see that your perceptions, emotions, and thoughts are not just reactions to the world, but predictions generated by a living system trying to keep you alive, the inner landscape of your life begins to look very different. Fear is one of the first experiences to change under this lens. Fear often feels like a faithful messenger from reality, as though it were simply reporting danger as it truly exists. A racing heart, a tight chest, and a flood of alarming thoughts seem to prove that something is wrong. But fear is also a prediction. It is the brain's forecast that harm is likely, combined with a set of bodily adjustments designed to prepare you to respond. Sometimes this forecast is accurate and life-saving. Other times it is exaggerated, outdated, or misplaced. When fear arises, you are not necessarily witnessing the world as it is. You are experiencing your brain's best guess about what might happen next based on past learning and current uncertainty. This does not make fear irrelevant. It makes it understandable. Instead of seeing fear as a personal weakness or a failure of character, you can begin to see it as an overprotective prediction system doing what it evolved to do. This perspective can soften the harsh inner judgments that often accompany anxiety. It creates room for curiosity rather than immediate resistance. You can ask what your brain is trying to protect you from, what assumptions it is making, and whether those assumptions still fit your present reality. Identity also takes on a new shape when you recognize the predictive nature of the mind. If your sense of self is something your brain is actively constructing, rather than a fixed essence you were born with, then who you are is not as rigid as it feels. Your habits, your preferences, and even your emotional patterns are not permanent traits carved into stone. They are parts of an internal model that can be updated. This makes personal change less mysterious. Growth becomes a matter of gradually reshaping the predictions your brain makes about who you are and how you act in the world. This understanding can be both humbling and empowering. It is humbling because it reveals how much of what feels like me is the product of automatic processes shaped by biology and experience. It is empowering because it shows that those processes are not fixed. With repetition, reflection, and new experiences, the brain can learn new models. New emotional responses can replace old ones. New identities can slowly take root. You are not trapped inside a single version of yourself. The predictive view of the mind also reframes free will in a quieter, more nuanced way. If your decisions begin in neural processes that operate before conscious awareness, then the feeling of freely choosing may not be the original cause of your actions. This can sound threatening at first, as though it removes responsibility and meaning from human life. But it does not erase choice. It changes what choice is. Choice becomes the expression of the whole system, not the command of a single inner ruler. Your values, habits, memories, and current state all contribute to what you do next. You are still involved in your actions, but not in the simple, centralized way that intuition suggests. This perspective can reduce the burden of self-blame. When you struggle to change a habit, it may not be because you are weak or broken. It may be because your brain's predictions about what is safe, rewarding, or necessary are deeply ingrained. Change then becomes less about forcing yourself and more about patiently reshaping those predictions through consistent experience. It also invites compassion toward others. When people behave in ways that seem irrational or harmful, their actions may be expressions of internal models shaped by histories you cannot see. Even moral responsibility begins to look different. Responsibility does not disappear, but it becomes paired with understanding. You can still hold people accountable while also recognizing that behavior arises from complex systems shaped by biology and environment. This dual awareness can support justice that is firm but less cruel, and self-discipline that is steady but less shaming. Perhaps the most subtle change happens in your relationship with your own thoughts. When you recognize that thoughts are predictions, rather than direct revelations of truth, they lose some of their authority. A catastrophic thought about the future becomes a forecast, not a prophecy. A harsh self-judgment becomes an internal model, not an objective verdict. You can learn to listen to your thoughts without automatically believing them. You can treat them as signals to be examined rather than commands to be obeyed. Over time, this shift can create a gentler inner climate. You may find it easier to pause, to question, and to choose how you respond rather than being swept away by the first story your brain presents. You may become more patient with your own uncertainty and more open to the idea that your current way of seeing the world is one possible construction among many. Recognizing the predictive nature of the mind does not make life less meaningful. It can make it more so. It invites you to participate more consciously in the ongoing construction of your reality. It shows you that your fears, your identity, and your choices are not fixed objects handed down to you, but living processes that can be understood, reshaped, and guided. In seeing how your mind creates the world you experience, you gain a quieter, deeper kind of freedom. Not the freedom of absolute control, but the freedom that comes from understanding the system you are living inside and learning to work with it, rather than being unknowingly ruled by it.